Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. This is the second of two episodes out in June. Last time we spoke to Peter Fleming, the author of Dark Academia, and Professor Simon Lilly about the state of universities today, taking a look at Leicester University in particular. A big theme of that discussion was worsening labour conditions under neoliberalism, and so today's discussion feels like a suitable follow-up, broadening that conversation out to the wider world of work. This month we published Amelia Horgan's excellent new book, Lost in Work, Escaping Capitalism. It's the latest in our Outspoken by Pluto series, and in the book Amelia poses three big questions. What is work? How does it harm us? And what can we do about it? The book looks at the history of work under capitalism, how the labour market has changed over time as well, and what the main continuities are with previous modes of capitalism. It also looks at questions of social reproduction and the trade union movement. Well, Amelia is here with us today on the show, and we're also very lucky to have with us Sarah Jaffe, a reporting fellow at Type Media Centre and the author of Work Won't Love You Back, which is published by Hearst. And also joining us on the panel is Orlando Lazar, a political theorist and college lecturer at the University of Oxford, whose research focuses on power and domination at work. So we'll be diving into that discussion in just a second. Firstly, as ever, a reminder that you can get 50% off Amelia's book for the next month by using the coupon podcast at the checkout on plutobooks.com. And lastly, it's now time for me to give a quick shout out to our newest Patreon patrons. Yasmina Nooni, Dustin Ward, Katie Bull, Mike Pepper, Vincent Perez, Daniel Weiser, Max Kaufman, Noah Martin, Josephine Becker, Jim Ritchie, Leah Lilith de Oliveira, Lauren D, and Christina Helton. So a big thanks to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement with Pluto's publishing. Patreon.com/Pluto Press is the URL for anyone who hasn't already joined us. There are a number of member benefits, including discounts, free ebooks and merchandise, and of course, the unabridged version of this podcast. Okay, without further ado, this is Amelia Horgan, Sarah Jaffe, and Orlando Lazar on Radicals in Conversation. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us today. So Amelia, congratulations on the book. It's a really brilliant read. I finished it just the other day, and I think, it draws together a lot of fascinating histories, case studies and theory in a sort of very articulate, persuasive way. So yeah, congrats on finishing it. Before we dive into some of the detail, most people listening will realise, whether or not we may like our own jobs, that work under capitalism is, pretty bad universally. So very briefly, what are some of the defining features of work in today's economy? And how is this landscape different from, say, 20 or 30 years ago?
In terms of how things have changed, I guess the main thing is a marked bifurcation in job quality. So the expansion of what we might basically term crap jobs and the dwindling number of jobs with better working conditions, better kind of autonomy, better control for workers in them. And that's been really marked in the last few decades, but particularly after the 2008 crash. What happens after COVID is not entirely clear yet. There's been a massive loss of jobs, especially for young people in the service sector, but there are some interesting developments with employers finding it difficult to fill those roles, meaning in some ways enhanced bargaining power for workers in those service jobs. And the other context of this is a general move of risk, a down transfer of risk from employers to employees. And that looks different in different sectors, of course. But one of the major things I'd say in Britain is increase in student debt and a kind of like almost pay-to-play model for work, where to be able to enter the workforce, you have to take on more risk, more debt.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we touched on COVID just a little bit there. I'm assuming the main conclusions or arguments of the book would have been the same if we'd published it 2 years ago, rather than this month in 2021. So, that being said, I guess I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts about what COVID's revealed in terms of how polarised the labour market has become, or, who is valued, who isn't valued under capitalism, that sort of thing.
This is Sarah. First of all, Amelia's book is amazing. Um, and I think the thing that COVID has done in a way is it's made it a lot harder to deny all of the stuff that all three of us write about, all of the ways that work is crap that were like already there. But now there's this sort of the workforce was essentially split into threes, right? There are people who kept their jobs and got to work from home. There are people who kept going into work and it got a lot more dangerous. And there are people who just got fired. And how that actually worked out, the specifics of it were, somewhat affected by national policy. But broadly, you were in one of those three situations and all of them sucked for various reasons. But one of the things that's been fascinating me for the last few weeks, months, is like this battle over people refusing to return to work and how nobody wants to work anymore, right? Because people who all, got fired from service industry jobs, say, because this really seems to be happening in like hospitality and food service, are understandably not rushing back to an industry where A, you've got people breathing on you all day, and B, like the conditions were awful to begin with. And I say this as somebody who spent 10 years of her life working in the service industry. Um, so it's fascinating to watch like people sort of just talking about, well, we need to just yank benefits away from people in order to force them back into the workforce. Because it is, again, this like pulling away of this veil and just being nakedly obvious that the whole point of labor market policy is to force people to take crappy jobs at low wages.
Mm. One thing that sort of comes up quite early on in your book, Amelia, is how the changing, I guess, labour market and the increasing sort of, the diminishing availability of well-paid, secure work, what the response has been from the political establishment to that, like how there's almost a sort of carrot and stick response, partly pathologizing the unemployed, but also like, telling people to get out there and hustle. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the dominant narratives that we hear about work at the moment.
Yeah, I think carrot and stick is a really good way of describing it. And you have an increase on conditionality in terms of accessing welfare benefits to kind of prove that you're really, really looking for work. And the rise of sanctions and a rise of a really kind of punitive culture of disbelief. And meanwhile, the what we might term a meritocratic ideology, in which the idea is that if you work hard, you'll get what you deserve. If you don't work hard, you'll also get what you deserve. That your standing is the product of your own hard work more than anything else, remains very dominant. Even though it's kind of being there's been a big rush of books around this, and it's been kind of called into question, but it is still very much the dominant ideology that how hard you work reflects what you get paid, how you're valued. So at the same time as the opportunity for permanent, secure work dwindles, this idea that you get what you deserve remains largely dominant.
Mm. But it's clear that there's not just like the problem of work, as you kind of refer to it, or the problem of capitalist work is not just about there's too many crap jobs and sort of an unfair distribution of access to those jobs, is it? There's, something more
Mm.
fundamental at play.
I think there's two levels at which the argument of the book kind of operates. One is to say, look at the distribution of jobs within society. Isn't this in many ways unfair and in many ways harmful? And then there's look at the way in which we work under capitalism in general, which requires this particular relationship of ownership. So one group of people are separated from ownership of the means of production, another group um, owns it. What does this mean for how we work? What does this mean for freedom? And I guess one of the points running through the book is that people tend to focus on the former. They also tend to focus on the former in a way which can also be quite misleading or quite ideological, which is just to say, okay, the problem is merely this, the distribution or merely the way in which these jobs are valued, and we can just kind of play around the edges of it a bit. But actually, we need to do both. But I think it's important to focus on the former because of the way in which the jobs we have and the shame around them and the ways they create our identities and our subjectivities is something that's really, really important. So, of course, these relations in the background are absolutely fundamental and are almost never discussed enough when we talk about capitalism or we talk about politics. But we mustn't also lose sight of the fact that these are relations which are lived by people. And this moment of the last determination isn't, while it conditions everything else, right, isn't always what we live. So I wanted in the book to talk about both and how they operate together, how people actually live those relations.
I think some of what you're talking about there sort of chimes with Sarah, your own book, Work Won't Love You Back, the idea of these kind of expectations about, we've got to love our jobs. That definitely seems to be like one key facet that comes up in both your books that definitely merits a lot of discussion. Do you want to say a little bit about Work Won't Love You Back, actually? Because it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a book about, as Amelia's been saying, the way that work and the expectations of work have changed, and the way that this idea that work is something that we will do out of love is an ideology and an expectation that's being forced on actually more and more people, regardless of whether their jobs are actually any good. And good by that, I mean, you have security, you're well paid, you have some autonomy, all of the things that we might think of that make a good job. But also now, we see these expectations placed on like home care workers who do incredibly emotionally and physically taxing work for minimum wage, going into people's homes to take care of them. And if they ask for a raise, it's like, well, don't you love your job? Shouldn't you be doing that work out of love? So I trace the way that this has spread from certain kinds of work that are certain kinds of gendered work, but also our ideas about creative work and how that spread to more and more of the economy at the same time as Amelia points out so well in her book, the conditions of actual work are getting worse for most people.
Yeah, definitely. Because, it used to be quite widely accepted that work was rubbish. You'd go and put in a shift, clock off at the end of the day and try not to think about it until, the following morning. Yeah. Why have things changed? How has this kind of myth that we should love our work taken hold?
I mean, the very short answer that I give to that is kind of it's about deindustrialization, because the bargain of industrial work, right? The bargain of the coal mines, say, was that like, yeah, this job sucks and it'll probably kill you young, right? It wrecks your body, but you get paid decently and you can support your family and you will have some level of security and a union. And that was a sort of class compromise that lasted for less time than people tend to think. And talking about coal miners, it ended rather spectacularly with Margaret Thatcher destroying the coal mines and the coal miners' unions, more importantly, right? So what comes after that is this very carrot and stick thing that we've been talking about, where, okay, you don't have to go down to the coal mines anymore. And coal miners are always used as the example now when like white collar workers are organizing, right? When the workers at Google formed a union, people who criticize them are like, well, you're not coal miners, you don't need any union protections. This sort of understanding that like these jobs sucked, right? And you couldn't really convince anybody that they should love being a coal miner because being a coal miner sucked. But in the guise of giving us what we wanted, which is ostensibly more lovable work, they've actually taken away all of the things that gave work any rewards.
Can I jump in for a sec? First of all, thanks for having me here, Chris. And I love Amelia's book, and I really like yours too, Sarah. I think this is something that's really interesting in both these books, right? You both talk about these changing legitimation stories given to workers, while trying to resist a pretty obvious response to these stories, which is to romanticize the kind of work we had 5 minutes ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And one of those things that I think comes out in the stuff about work loving you back, and certainly comes out in Amelia's book, is about the boundaries of work. So, Sarah, you were just talking about how you could go home at the end of the day and just forget about it, right? And of course, these boundaries are just under attack on so many fronts. And COVID hasn't helped that, right? It's accelerated it. These changes can go from being new and scary and really hard to understand and so impossible to change to being normal and unexceptional and just what work is. And so also impossible to change really quickly. So yeah, I found that really interesting. I wonder if either of you would like to talk about those boundaries a bit more.
Yeah, I think the temporal element of contemporary work is really, really significant. And it does look, that blurring of that boundary looks really different in different parts of the economy, right? But that feeling that one must like always be kind of effectively on call, and what this means for freedom is something that I think is really, really concerning. In some jobs, it looks like the expectation that you'll always be checking your email in shift work and 0 hours contracts, there's an issue where you basically have to be ready to be called in at any point, not knowing what your work pattern will be, not knowing how long you'll be working for, how much money you have. This really is very different to the kind of, I guess, Fordist compromise that Sarah was talking about, where you have the ability to plan long term, right? And I guess there is, people talk about precariousness and precarity a lot, and this temporal element, this kind of anxious taking on of this temporal burden or this temporal suffering seems like a really important bit of contemporary work. And what that often looks like is this blurring of that boundary. And this has all kinds of effects on people's lives, right? And I guess it makes it seem like not just their working lives, but then the question is your whole life, right, becomes your working life in a way that isn't in this kind of Fordist moment where you have your job and then you have your leisure time, and then you have your retirement. It means that all of life can be excavated for work, or could possibly be at any moment, which is a very different way to live and throws up very different possibilities of living and of social relationships, in a way which should be really, really troubling to almost anyone, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that made me think of this article that people were sharing the other day that I think was from the New York Times or something, where people were like, you should like curate your friends better, because if you have like fat friends, you're going to be fat. And if you have lazy friends, you're going to be lazy. And I'm just like, God, this is so depressing. But like, I also, was thinking about dating apps because like I'm single, and the idea of being on a dating app just feels like another job application.
Mm.
And as a
Mm,
person who is like morally and politically opposed to jobs, I hate the way that like the logic of work is creeping into our social interactions. And, the way that like the smartphone, which is ostensibly this gadget invented to make our lives better, actually just becomes your boss in a way, whether you are somebody like me and you have to sort of promote your articles all the time because I'm a freelance journalist. And so this is how I get paid, or you're an Uber driver or a Deliveroo courier or something where, you have to turn on the app to get work. And then, the company wants to have a big negotiation about whether every minute you have the app on is working time, which I think is like, it's a very specific practical question in terms of minimum wage law, but it's also like a sort of existential question in a way, right? Like every minute that you are sitting there looking at the app, waiting for a fare to come along, that is work. That is time in which, as Amelia would point out, like you are not free. And the company really doesn't want to pay for that. It only wants to pay for like the absolute minimum time that you are actually working, while it wants the expansion of your time in other ways. And so I think this is the boundarylessness of these things facilitated by these, annoying gadgets that we all carry around.
Mm.
mm,
For me, it just kind of, and I accept that this is not even perhaps the majority experience during the pandemic, but the move to remote working does feel like it kind of ties in with what you're all saying. The fact that there's less of a boundary between work time and, your own time. And it definitely bleeds across that boundary when you're just sat maybe working in your living room.
Yeah, and this is a small thing, but the time at which emails come in has grown later and later throughout the pandemic. And you can tell that people are working later in the evening. They might be starting later in the day. There are some ways in which working from home like allows you to control your time in some cases. But you see this kind of general seepage, I guess. And I think it points to the kind of subjects that contemporary capitalism is good at creating. And one of these is the kind of person who is very anxiously curating their own social capital. And the worst thing you could possibly do is squander it, which I think comes across in that really heinous article. This kind of process of responsibilization where it kind of sits within the meritocratic stuff as well as this general down transfer of risk. So you become responsible for your training, you become responsible for your performance in a way that wouldn't necessarily be the case a few decades ago. So it is all on you. And that extends not only to more of like your working activity, but to your social life as well, to your personal life. I guess it's no wonder that it seems like for a lot of people, the dominant kind of affect is like exhaustion, is tiredness. Again, this does look really, really different for like different parts of the economy. I think we have to, the way in which this is experienced by the kind of curation of online appearance that like an Uber driver does, and the way in which like the workplace is managed there is different to the way in which like freelance, more creative jobs are like. But you can see why there is this general feeling of exhaustion comes from this responsibilization, this experience of time, which does leave people feeling completely exhausted. And I think it opens up some interesting, I guess, strategic possibilities around campaigning. So the legal stuff around exactly what work is really important there, but there's also kind of demands that unions can be making, that people can be making in workplaces around commuting time or around emails, around like switching off, the right to switch off, this kind of stuff. And those are quite interesting because they're very tangible to a lot of people, and people are so exhausted that there is an interesting opening there, I think.
Yeah, I want to jump back to some concrete examples on that, but I just wanted to throw out one of the things that I stole from my friend Adam Kotsko in my book was he writes about sort of neoliberalism as a machine for generating blame, and specifically
Mm.
for like that responsibilization that you write about, right? That like this era of capitalism is marked by privatization in so many ways, but one of them is this like the privatization of stress, as Mark Fisher wrote, and this idea that if we are not succeeding, it must be because of choices that we made that were bad. And it is our own fault. And this, I think, goes really hand in hand with this labor of love shtick, right? Which is that, like, if you don't love your job, the problem is you. And you must either try harder to love your job or go find another one that is more lovable in some way. The same logic as the dating app, right? Um, and the way that we end up sort of demonized, and you see this in like the demonizing of like the welfare queen, the benefit scrounger, right? That goes back to again the thing I was talking about earlier with people being forced off benefits and back into work now, even though it's not actually really that safe. And so all of this is acting on us in all of these ways that does create this exhaustion and this like anxiety all the time, right? That you have to sort of check your phone constantly, right? Because like you might be getting a text, the dating app might be going off, your boss might be emailing you at 3 in the morning, whatever it is, like all of these sort of notifications, notifications, notifications. And if you miss one, it is somehow your fault and it's going to ruin your entire life. And this is just like feeling of precarity being expanded, right, in so many ways. But in terms of the right to switch off and things like that, I'm thinking about the New Yorker magazine, right? The fancy New Yorker magazine, which is in the middle of a union contract battle and basically is about to go out on strike. They're picketing Anna Wintour's house this weekend, which is awesome. And one of the things that they're trying to win is a right to close off, a time at which they will no longer be available to answer emails. Or if they have to do really late nights to like get an issue out or something like that, that they can recoup that time later as time off, right? As leisure time, because they so often just work these insane hours and they're up till all hours. And of course, it's all sold to you as, well, you work at the New Yorker and isn't it wonderful? And don't you love it here? And it's so prestigious.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, right? One part is that, in a sense, this work-life distinction has always been false. Even when it was premised upon this kind of secure Fordist job, you go home exhausted, you have these physical, mental problems. I mean, I worked as a dishwasher for a bit, and when you're lying in bed, you see your hands washing dishes above your head, right? You can't really get rid of those, but there's this certain character to a lot of the modern encroachments on free time, where it's packaged, as you say, in this language of responsibility or self-care or self-improvement, often in really physical ways. There was a leaflet released from Amazon the other day. I'm sure you saw it, right? It was about how workers ought to treat themselves like industrial athletes and eat healthily and drink water and exercise on their days off. And it's not really a coincidence that the next day we saw that they have enormous rates of workplace injury. And it's about curating your life outside work, explicitly outside work.
Did you all see the Amazon booth?
Oh yeah.
The
Yes.
Amazon people who are listening who haven't heard this, like Amazon's answer to its workers being stressed and trying to unionize is to get a weird, creepy little like wellness phone booth that you can theoretically go into in the warehouse. I don't know how that's going to count for time off task, but And they're literally calling it Amazon, and that is just the funniest and most horrifying thing I've ever heard.
It also just looks like a sort of 2006 desktop computer in a portaloo in the middle of a warehouse. It doesn't look very realistic.
Oh, goodness.
Talking about like how work is making these demands or like trying to curate our lives sort of outside of work, that's not entirely new though, is it? I guess because, wasn't Henry Ford quite into that too?
Yeah, Henry Ford is super into this stuff, and there are kind of these controls on what people can do in their private lives, and there's also this deeply bizarre public kind of show ritual that was done for workers, and primarily immigrant workers, where they would go into they made like an actual big pot, and all the workers would do this parade, and they would be wearing their national costume first, and they would come out on the other side in American dress. Uh,
Wow.
so I think that there is in certain bits of the economy, there's definitely this kind of thing before. I mean, there's the kind of historian part of me which goes, there's a contingency and continuity kind of are so important here. And at the same time, it does seem like there is something that is, so the background power relations are unchanged. You still have that division of ownership. Depending on when we're comparing to, we have different bargaining power, different general power of workers. But it does seem like technology, and not to get all phones are so bad, but I do think there is something that is particularly harmful about the way in which it can be used now, the immediacy of the demands that can be made. So the inability of kind of hiding from them at any point. So I think there's definitely continuity there, and there's lots of historical stuff about the precariousness of particular sectors and the way in which a lot of work was looking for work in the way that it is now. I think we've got to be careful to avoid, on the one hand, overstating the change, but also underplaying this significant shift that comes from the particular temporalities of this technologically enabled precarity. Yeah.
Well, right. I mean, we know from feminism that, the home has always been a workplace, right? And it was always a workplace where the work was sort of never done and was unpaid. And so, in this way, like, I think it's really important to look back at those analyses of reproductive labor and which work was paid and unpaid in order to realize the way that capital worms its way into all of these different facets of our lives and does it in different ways. So now, more and more women are still doing all of the reproductive work. And this was a big battle line that emerged during the pandemic, right? I don't know the numbers in the UK, but in the US, like, all of the jobs lost in a certain period of time were lost by women. And they were mostly, there was too much to do with working from home and also taking care of children and all of the work that needed to be done in the home that wasn't waged. This can be a really important lens to look at the way that, again, the continuities and the differences, and to be really specific, as Amelia was saying, about what has changed and what has not changed.
It'd be good to talk a bit more about some of the social reproduction theory sides of the conversation, because listeners on this show will be familiar with that. We've talked about it in the past, the idea of what happens outside of the hours 9 to 5, so 5 to 9, and how it's actually a really important aspect to any analysis of work under capitalism. I mean, Amelia, in the book you talk about wages for housework, which is quite an interesting case study, I suppose. Could you talk a little bit more about that and talk about its aims and the importance of it, and maybe some of the shortcomings of that approach as well?
I think one of the important things about wages for housework is the way in which a demand is made within it. So, for those who don't know, it was a kind of international movement to make visible the invisibilized labor that's done in the home, and also to claim the work of housewives as part of like working class work, right? To say this isn't some separate activity, this isn't some kind of natural separate thing, that this is involved in the reproduction of labor power and the reproduction of capitalism as a whole, right? So there's two reproductions that are taking place. There's the immediate capacity to go out and work the next day, and then there's the production or the reproduction of society as a whole. So there's two temporalities there. And what I think is really fascinating is the way in which this demand makes that very visible, makes visible in quite provocative way that this thing is done for free. It says, look, this isn't natural. This might appear as something natural, but actually it isn't that. It's a feminist demand in multiple directions. One is to recognize women as part of the working class, even when they're not appearing as doing the waged work. And another is to denaturalize what appears as kind of the natural work of love. I think that is a really fascinating kind of legacy. There's a kind of move that goes from demanding pay to calling for a revaluation of that work. And I think one thing that's really powerful in the original formulation is that this work has this kind of double character. On the one hand, it is relational, it does involve care, it is emotionally valuable to those doing it. But on the other hand, what is being produced here is firstly that the potential required for exploitation, and secondly, capitalism as a whole, right? And these two things are the things we really want to be involved in the production of. And I think that is really, really powerful. I think one thing that often gets kind of submerged in some discussions of it is that it's we go a bit too far towards the other end, and we talk about care as if it's just this wonderful, brilliant resource that is undervalued that we can just value again, when actually it's worth thinking about what exactly are we producing? How are we all made to reproduce capitalism, reproduce labor power? And what does that mean? What does it mean to be someone who is producing that, right? Like what kind of relations does that cause? What kind of sort of activities does that involve? It's really provocative and really fascinating as a demand. But I think bringing it back to that question of what is being produced seems really important.
You've talked about touched on another kind of element of the book, which is quite interesting, and especially at this kind of particular phase of capitalism or whatever, how work obviously makes intense demands on us sort of bodily, physically, but there's also this increasing expectation that we deploy our personalities and emotional states, as part of our work as well. This idea of emotional labor. Does anyone want to jump in on how this expectation that we perform emotionally and bring our personalities and everything into play, how's that crept in?
Yeah, I mean, I think emotional labor has been such an interesting, in some ways, example of concept creep. Like everybody on the internet throws around the term emotional labor to the point where it's often almost meaningless. It's kind of like anytime you have a feeling about work. But the way that I like to think about it, taking from Arlie Russell Hochschild's original definition, is that it's about the production of feeling in someone else. And in order to produce those feelings, which are they do have value, right? They do produce value, but it's very hard to calculate exactly how much, unless you're working for tips, in which case, yeah. So you have to control your feelings in order to produce that set of feelings, depending on what the desired feeling to be produced is, right? When I was waiting tables, my job was to make customers feel safe and happy and like they wanted to buy another bottle of wine and tip me 20%. And to do that, you had to not only sort of constantly put on a smile, but you also had to sort of read the people, figure out what particular kind of sucking up basically different customers wanted. You had to deal with, I mean, when I was, younger and young enough that I looked like I was still in university, and people would be like, "Oh, are you in school? What are you studying?" And all of these annoying personal questions, all of these things that you have to manage your own emotional response to in order to make sure that the customer remains happy. There are other types of emotional labor, right? When you think about being a healthcare worker and you're trying to get patients to get better. And in fact, in the original study, Hochschild wrote about debt collectors, bill collectors. And so they had to manage to sort of screw up this angry and intimidating persona, which is also a form of emotional labor. And one of the things, again, that I think is interesting about this sort of, quasi-collective refusal to return to the service industry is that these are jobs that require a large amount of this kind of work. And, if this is a thing that we could actually prove is really happening and not just, anecdata from a bunch of signs that people have stuck in restaurant windows, I do like to think of it as kind of a big emotional labor strike.
Wasn't there an example of airline sort of hosts and hostesses going on
smile strikes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is such I suppose,
strike.
one of the quintessential displays of where that emotional labor is kind of in full force. So it must be quite disconcerting to witness.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I think one thing that's interesting is where that emotional labor in the service sector meets the really metricized neoliberal workplace management. One story I write about in the book is So a lot of people will have seen there are these signs in tube stations, right? And the workers in the tube stations will write some kind of quote on them, and these are often like very charming, or sometimes like very kitsch, but like they're quite lovely, right? And people would share these and be like, "This is so exciting." um, so you have that, and then I went along to an RMT branch meeting to talk about kind of working conditions on one of these new concessions, which is a new way of running railways. And on it, what they'd have to do is, so remember these original signs. What happens now is that they're sent a quote to write as if they had written it themselves, and they have to write it there, and they have to then send a picture back on this internal app to be like, we've done it, right? So you have this kind of original, spontaneous thing that comes up in this relational work, that comes up in this work, which can be a motive, can involve the organic as well as the forced kind of production of feelings. And then you have it appear as a kind of metric. And the kind of misery involved in that is something that's kind of fascinating, because there can also be a fascination with the appearance of like particular modes of emotionality. Like, are you smiling? Are you making a kind of effort in the right way? Yeah, and it's interesting to see that creep to sectors in which people aren't really customers, but you can be made to feel as if they are or should be, right? Like, is someone commuting to work a customer? Should they be thought of as a customer? What is the difference between like a passenger and a customer? And what does that mean for the intensification of that job, the intensification of the emotional kind of state production?
Since you are in academia, both of you actually, I think, right? This just made me think, of course, of students now being treated as customers,
Yeah.
Mm,
and the way that that changes how professors and teachers have to interact with students.
And yeah,
yeah.
it's a skill, right? It's a skill that a lot of academics don't have. I mean, you don't need to really have that skill, but it's emotional labor is skilled labor a lot of the time, and it makes the job one that lots of people aren't qualified to do. I'm not very qualified to do that. I think something interesting about those train signs as well, though, is that it's a skill that can be de-skilled, right? This de-skilling of emotional labor is really, really interesting and kind of grim. I mean, you see it in a lot of call center technology now as well. There's this TUC report on algorithmic management that just came out, and they've got these examples in there of these programs that you're on a call in a call center, and it'll flash up a little heart emoji if you're being insufficiently empathetic somehow, or a little kind of coffee cup. You're not being peppy enough, right?
Oh my
And
God.
this is it's in a sense it's the production of emotion,
Yeah.
but it's not really the alienation of these skills that we use in social life. It's the replacement of them.
Mm,
And so there's this odd polarization of emotional labor, right? You've got very skilled service work, emotional labor that is exhausting and draining. Then you've got this completely de-skilled algorithmic emotional labor. And then you've got vast
Mm.
swathes of the economy where they couldn't care less if you were exhibiting the right emotions. There's no legitimation story. You're just being managed like a machine. And it's these weird three groups.
Yeah, I find that so interesting. If you've used like one of the chat services, like text-based chat to get help from, my mobile phone or something like that, and they have these scripts, and I presume at least in that case they can just literally like cut and paste like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I want to make sure that you're having a better day, and like
Mm.
all of this like just like over the top smarm, and I'm like, you don't have to do that with me. I just need my phone to work, you know? But the way that it becomes like made entirely absurd by having to like text out all of this emotive language in order to try to like convey that the person on the other end of this chat bot, who is probably monitoring like 5 of these at the same time, right, somehow has a lot of emotions about like, my phone not working, whatever it might be. It sort of shows you that like capitalism still can't quite comprehend like genuine human feeling, and so it has to essentially just tailorize it.
mm. This is one of the things where technology has a really interesting role to play, which is that they now have these massive data sets, presumably, in the same way that, when you write an email, if you've got Grammarly or whatever similar product, it has that little thing that pops up and says, this email comes across this way. Is that right? So there is this collection of massive data sets which can be used for algorithmic kind of learning, and thinking about like, what does this kind of bit of text normally do? How does this make people feel? How do people respond to this? And that is really fascinating. And I think it points to I know you spoken about before, Orlando, which is the way in which there's a kind of simple assumption that more machines or algorithmic management is like somehow neutral or will be a good judge in a way that people are kind of fallible or subject to their own emotional states. But it points the way in which, like, as Sarah was just talking about, like, there's a kind of strange inbuilt emotionality, which at some point back down the chain derives from what some human has plugged in, and their assumptions. And this creates all kinds of like weird and exploitative, strange ways of interacting through these like online processes, where at some point it was decided that this response is needed or this style of talking at this particular moment is what's needed. And I guess we'll probably presumably see like a lot more of this as this tendency to de-skill that more routine bits of service or emotional work happens. Yeah.
Orlando, did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, so as you say, Amelia, the removal of something human from the workplace and from the relationship between customers and firms, it can seem very weird. It can seem very sort of sci-fi. And I think it gives a lot of people a bit of future shock. And organizations like unions, right, they're trying to grapple with this idea of being managed by machines in the workplace too. But it's so weird that you get these various odd strands of responses to it. Within the workplace, I think a lot of that fear focuses on losing the human bit of human managers, right? In all these stories about Amazon workers being governed by algorithms and automatically sacked 10% of their workforce every year, things like that, you get these strange reactions that try and put human managers back in the process. In the TUC report I mentioned, there are quite a few quotes about how we're losing some humanity here, and at least you can reason with a human manager. And it's a very weird period of coming to grips with the idea of algorithmic management, because we haven't lost human managers, right? They're still there. They still have power. They're in fact given a lot more power by the widespread use of things like productivity algorithms, which can be overridden at places like Amazon anyway. But it can make it much harder to see where the power is when you feel like you're being governed by an algorithm, by a computer.
I've been talking to and writing about a lot of Uber drivers lately, and the ways that like the algorithm actually micromanages like so much faster and more imperceptibly, right? That's a terrible way to phrase that, but you know what I mean? That the algorithms literally like adjust constantly to pay you essentially like the least possible amount that they can get away with paying you. And that this is like happening all the time with every ride, with every person that logs into the app, that the algorithm is calculating like basically how to screw them over in these ways that like we can't even begin to understand. And so one of the things that's interesting is like these fights that the drivers are having over trying to get access to some of this data, because it's so impenetrable and it is complicated, but like it doesn't have to be this way, right? It's not like necessarily complicated. It's complicated because they're trying to like wring out the last possible pennies of exploitation.
I mean, it can feel very arbitrary, but of course it's not arbitrary. It's carefully calibrated. In a sense, it is much less arbitrary than human management, because an algorithm doesn't harass you or insult you, or let's assume it's a procedurally fair one, right? It doesn't discriminate against you because of what you look like or what you sound like. But of course, it's much, much better than any human manager could be at doing one thing, which is wringing out this value from you. So there's this promise buried within algorithms that at least they're not human beings who can do all sorts of formal and informal exercises of their every whim. They can be sort of petty tyrants. But surrounding all that is this way in which algorithms give so much more power to the people at the top of corporations, as you say, like Uber, but also like more traditional workplaces, warehouses, things like that.
It's interesting how there's two strands. You could welcome an algorithm on the one hand because of that removal of the interpersonal thing of hating your boss, but it still leaves intact the question of who has control and power in a given workplace. And I suppose that's the main question that you seem to come back to a lot in the book, Amelia, is looking at kind of control, and control being a key sort of feature to the problem of work under capitalism. There's a couple of interesting examples actually in the book that you touch on as sort of instances of radical workers' control, that either never came to be or sort of were cut down in their prime, but that would be maybe nice to touch on, perhaps by way of moving the conversation into some questions on like organizing and the union movement today. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about like the Paris Commune or the
Lucas Plan? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Paris Commune is this short-lived and brutally put down experiment in workers' control. And one of the first things that is done is that some of the really cruel or kind of ultra-exploitative practices are banned. So night work for bakers and things like fines levied on workers. There's some interesting stuff there because I think there's this kind of myth of this free and equal labor contract. Which persists, which is, two people come together and they make this contract and they're equal partners in it and so on. And of course, there's the fact that this is a fiction in and of itself, but there's the historical stuff about the ways in which workers are fined for not meeting particular commitments or for leaving the employment contract early and this kind of thing. So that's one example, and a really, really fascinating experiment in workers' control. The other one I talk about in the book, and I think this has a lot of there's a lot to think about in what this might mean for future Green New Deals or how we approach questions of a just transition in the face of climate crisis or climate systems breakdown. So the Lucas Plan was when an aerospace manufacturer was going to shut down, and the workers there across all grades put together a plan to keep the factory going and change it from producing arms to producing kind of socially useful commodities. And there's a really great documentary, I think it's on YouTube, I'd recommend watching it, of lots of, including what these things were like. And so there was some hospital, medical equipment, really strange vehicles, really cool stuff. But they produce these plans, but it's not kind of taken up. But I think what's really fascinating about that is the way in which, well, lots of things, but one thing that stands out to me is the way in which workers have knowledge about the stuff they're doing, right? This might seem obvious if you've worked in like a cafe, for example, and you go into another cafe and you see the way stuff is laid out, and you know that the way it's laid out it doesn't make sense, or something is kind of odd, and you have this kind of embodied knowledge about that workplace. The fact that workers have this knowledge is downplayed in the normal discussion of workplace democracy, which goes something like, wouldn't that be nice, but it's inefficient? Well, it actually seems like workers have quite good knowledge about their work process in lots of different ways. And I think the Lucas Plan shows that. Then there's a question of what we do with jobs in sectors which are harmful. So obviously arms manufacturing is one of them, but also what do we do with fossil fuel industry work? Like, how do we approach that? It seems totally unacceptable to be like, well, let's just get rid of those jobs. Those jobs shouldn't exist. The jobs as they currently are, of course, shouldn't exist, but like, how do we replace those jobs? What do we do? And workers' knowledge about their work processes might in some ways hold the key.
I find all of that so interesting because, like, one of the things that I argue in my book is that we are dealing with the sort of after effects of the defeat of the changing labor movement of the 60s, right? Which was, in a lot of ways, seeing workers who had an objectively good situation at places like the Lordstown factory in Ohio, right? Which is something everybody who's heard me talk before has heard me talk about. I'm sorry, I'm obsessed. It's a General Motors factory. It's not anymore, it closed, but where they had objectively a good union contract. These were good jobs. You could buy a nice house in the area. It was a lovely place to be. And the workers were like, yeah, but turns out that being on an assembly line for 40 years of your life is still not a great way to live. And we'd like something else, please. And even the union leadership didn't really understand them, right? So they had a couple of very well publicized sort of wildcat strikes there that the union basically, tried to stifle because it didn't really understand these workers wanting more than a decent wage and buying a house. And what happened, instead of the union movement understanding these demands and trying to figure out how to sort of reincorporate demands for workers' control back into their struggle, capital did instead and sold us be your own boss.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about how those higher level demands can seem and are made to seem indulgent or self-indulgent, right? When there's all sorts of lacks of control that Amelia was talking about. You don't control whether you have to sell your labour power. When you're in the workplace, you don't control what you do all day. It can seem almost utopian to start dreaming about controlling what you're making, what you're doing, control over what your labor power actually does for society. And I think you see that in the tech industry strikes in the US as well. People at Google, people at other tech corporations, trying to exercise some control over the software they're developing and its social effects. And I think you quite often see people treating them as if they're asking for far too much. When others have so little, how can you possibly ask for control over that part of your work? High order questions. But of course that's important. Right, of course it is. That's the thing at the top of the rung. That's social control over what we do with our work.
Yeah, and I think the Google and others are a really interesting example in that way, because like they are making demands that aren't about money, because like nobody would really pay that much attention if Google engineers were, calling for $300,000 a year instead of $200,000 a year or whatever, right? But they are making demands around things like, we don't want to work on technology that the US government is going to use to create Muslim lists or deport people. Or, they didn't want to work on various kind of walled garden Chinese internet projects. And so their organizing demands really start with an awareness of how much power they do have within these companies, and trying to sort of overcome the way that their work still gets tailorized, right? It still gets broken down into little bits, so they don't really know what they're working on. And then when they find out that they're working on Project Maven or whatever, it becomes horrifying.
That was Amelia Horgan, Sarah Jaffe, and Orlando Lazar on Radicals in Conversation. If you're enjoying today's discussion and you want to keep listening, then head over to patreon.com/Pluto Press, where members can access the unabridged version of today's and previous episodes of the podcast. Just a reminder again that Lost in Work is available for podcast listeners with 50% off on plutobooks.com. Just use the coupon podcast at the checkout. We'll be back next month with another episode of Radicals in Conversation. So until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.